We stood there facing each other for a bit. I felt nothing but an inward glow of satisfaction at having, as I thought, acted honorably. As to him, I think he was simply made dumb with rage. At last he bowed with his hands on his heart, and said that he would not even ask now for the favor of kissing my hand. I appreciated his delicacy at that moment. It would have been an immense trial to my shyness. I think now that he was simply afraid of putting my hand to his lips, lest he should lose his self-control and bite it. He told me later, in one of those moments when people don't care what they say, that at that moment he positively hated me. Not the sight of me, you understand, but my aristocratic insolence. She paused, and in the youthful sincerity of his sympathy, Cosmo uttered a subdued exclamation of distress. Madame de Monteveso looked at him again, and then averted her face. I heard afterwards some gossip to the effect that he had been jilted by a girl to whom he was engaged, the daughter of some captain on half pay, and that he proposed to me simply to show her that he could find a girl prettier, of higher rank, and in every way more distinguished, that would consent to be his wife. I believe that it was this that prevented him from drawing back before my frankness. As to me, I went home, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, caring for nothing, as though I had done with the world, as though I had taken the veil. I can find no other comparison for the peace that was in me. I faced my mother's reproaches calmly. She was, of course, very much hurt at my not confiding in her at this crisis of my life. My father, too. But how could I have confided in them in this matter on which their security and welfare depended? How could I have confided in any of the men and women around me who seemed to me as if mad, whose conduct and opinions I despised with youthful severity as foolish and immoral? There was one human being in the world in whom I might perhaps have confided. That perhaps would have understood me. That was your father, Cosmo. But he was 300 miles away. There was no time. Tell me, did he understand? Has he cast me out of his thoughts forever? My father, said Cosmo, has lived like a hermit for years. There was nothing to make him forget you. Yes, he was a man in whom you could have confided. He would have understood you. That doesn't mean to say that he would have approved. I wish he had been by your side. He would have brought pressure on your parents with the authority of an old and tried friend. And benefactor, struck in the Countess de Monteveso. My father, I believe, had an inkling of the truth. He begged me again and again to think well of what I was doing. I told him that I was perfectly satisfied with what I had done. It was perfectly true then. I had satisfied my conscience by telling my suitor that I could never love him. I felt strangely confident that I could fulfill the duties of my new position, and I was absorbed by the happiness of having saved my parents from all anxiety for the future. I was not aware of having made any sacrifice. Probably if I had been 20 or more, I would have been less confident. Perhaps I would have had the courage. But at that age, I didn't know that my whole life was at stake. 3 weeks afterwards, I was married. As you see, there was no time lost. During that period, our intercourse was of the most formal kind, only I never even attempted to observe him with any attention. He was very stiff and ceremonious, but he was in a hurry, because I believe he was afraid from his previous experience that I would change my mind. His usual answer to the expression of all my wishes and to most of my speeches was a profound bow, and sometimes I was amused. In the lightness of my heart, a thought would come to me that a lifetime on such terms would be a funny affair. I don't say he deceived me in anything. He had brought an immense fortune out of India, and the world took him at its face value. With no more falsehood than holding his tongue and watching his behavior, he kept me in the dark about his character, his family, his antecedents, his very name. When we first were married, he was ostentatious and rather mean at the same time. His long life in India added the force of Oriental jealousy to that which would be in a sense natural to a man of his age. Moreover, his character was naturally disagreeable. The only way he could make the power of his great fortune felt was by hurting the feelings of other people, of his servants, of his dependents, of his friends. His wife came in for her share. An older and cleverer woman with a certain power of deception and caring for the material pleasures of life could have done better for herself and for him in the situation in which I was placed. But I, almost a child, with an honest and proud character and caring nothing for what wealth could give, I was perfectly helpless. I was being constantly surprised and shocked by the displays of evil passions and his fits of ridiculous jealousy, which were expressed in such a coarse manner that they could only arouse my resentment and contempt. Meantime we lived in great style. Dinner parties, concerts. I had a very good voice. I dare say he was anxious enough to show off his latest acquisition, but at the same time he could not bear me being looked at or even spoken to. A fit of Oriental jealousy would come over him, especially when I had been much applauded. He would express his feelings to me in barrack-room language. At last, one evening he made a most scandalous scene before about 200 guests, and then went out of the house, leaving me to make the best of it before all those people. It caused the greatest possible scandal. The party, of course, broke up. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my bedroom, too overcome to take off my splendid dress and those jewels with which he always insisted I should bedeck myself. With the first signs of dawn he returned, and coming up into my room found me sitting there. He told me then that living with me was too much of a torture for him, and proposed I should go back to my parents for a time. We had been married for a little over a year then. For the first time since the wedding I felt really happy. They, poor dears, were delighted. We were all so innocent together that we thought this would be the end of all our troubles, that the man was chivalrous enough to have seen his mistake in the proper light, and to bear the consequences nobly. Hadn't I told him I could never love him exactly in so many words? I ought to have known that he was incapable of any generosity. As a matter of fact, I didn't think much about it. I, who had overcome my shyness enough to become, young as I was, a perfect hostess in a world which I knew so little, because, after all, that sort of thing was in my tradition, I was really too stupid, too unsophisticated for those 10 months to have been a lesson to me. I had learned nothing, any more than one learns from a nightmare or from a period of painful illness. I simply breathed freely. I became again the old Adele. I dismissed Monsieur de Monteveso from my thoughts as though he had never lived. Can you believe this, Cosmo? It is astonishing how facts can fail to impress one. Brutalities, abuse, scenes of passion, mad exhibitions of jealousy, as long as they do not attack your conception of your moral personality. All this fell off me like a poisoned robe, leaving hardly a smart behind. I raised my head like a flower after a thunderstorm. Don't think my character is shallow, Cosmo. There were depths in me that could be reached. But till then I had been only tormented, shocked, surprised, but hardly even frightened. It was he who had suffered. But my turn was to come. I don't think you were ever a person of shallow feeling. One's feelings must mature like everything else. And I assure you I had not yet stopped growing. The next 6 months were to finish my education. For by that time I had lost all my illusions, while I was breathing freely between my father and mother, forgetting the world around us. Monteverso was going about the town with his complaints and his suspicions, regretting he had let me go, and enraged that I should have gone from him so easily. And you may be sure he found sympathizers. A rich man, you understand. Who could refuse sympathy to so much wealth? He was obviously a much ill-used man. All the faults, of course, were on my side. In less than a month I found myself the center of underhand intrigues and the victim of a hateful persecution. Friends, relatives, mere acquaintances in the world of emigration entered Monsieur de Monteverso's service. They spied on my conduct and tampered with the servants. There were assemblies in his house where my character was torn to shreds. Some of those good friends offered him their influence in Rome for the annulation of the marriage, for a consideration, of course. Others discovered flaws in the marriage contract. They invented atrocious tales. There were even horrid verses made about that scandal, till at last he himself became disgusted with the wretches and closed his house and his purse to them. Years later he showed me a note of their names and the amounts paid for all those manifestations of sympathy. He must have been impressed and disgusted by the retrospect, because it was a big lot of money. As to the names, they were aristocratic enough to flatter his plebeian pride. He showed the list to me just to hurt my feelings. Some sinners have been stoned, but I, an innocent girl of 17, have been pelted with mud beyond endurance. It was impossible to induce him to come to any sort of arrangement that would leave me in peace. All the world, influenced by his paid friends, was against me. What could I do? Calumnies are hard to bear, harder than truth. Even my parents weakened. He promised to make amends. Of course I went back to him, as one would crawl out of the mud amongst clean thorns that can but tear one's flesh. He received me back with apologies that were as nearly public as such things can be. It was a vindication of my character. But directly he had me with him again, he gave way to his fits of hatred as before. Such hatred as only black jealousy can inspire. It was terrible, for even jealousy has its gradations, colored by doubts and hopes, and his was the worst, the hopeless kind, since he could never forget my honest declaration. The Countess de Monteverso's voice died out, and then Cosmo looked up. She was a little pale, which made her eyes appear darker than ever he had seen them before. Cosmo was too young yet to understand the full meaning of this confession, but his very youth invested the facts with a sort of romantic grandeur, while the woman before him felt crushed by the feelings of their squalid littleness. Without looking at him, she said, "We went traveling for a year and a half, stayed for a time in Paris, where he began to make me scenes again. And then we went on to Italy. The pretext was to make me known to some of his relations. I don't believe he could remember his mother and his father, and an old dealer in rabbit skins, I believe, had died some time before. As to the rest, I think his heart failed him, notwithstanding the brutal pride he used at times to display to me. He took me to see some decayed people living in old ruined houses, whom I verily believe he bribed to pass for his more distant connections. It was a strange pilgrimage among the most squalid shams, something that you cannot conceive. Yet I didn't rebel against the horrible humiliation of it. It was part of the bargain. Sometimes I thought that he would kill me in one of those wild places, in some lost valley where the people, only a degree removed from peasants in their dress and speech, fawned upon him as the wealthy cousin and benefactor. I am certain that during those wanderings he was half distracted. It was I who went through all this unmoved. But I don't suppose my life was ever in any danger. At that time none of his moods lasted long enough to let him carry out any definite purpose. And then, he is not a man of criminal instincts. After all, he is perhaps a great adventurer. He has commanded armies of 100,000 men. He has, in a sense, faced the power of England in India. The very fact that he had managed to get out of it with so much wealth, and with quite a genuine reputation, shows that there is something in him. I don't know whether it's that obtained for him a very gracious reception from Bonaparte when he dragged me back to Paris. Chapter 6. Madame de Monteveso paused, looking at the white ashes in which the sparks had not died out yet. Yes, she went on, I lived near Paris through the whole time of the Empire. I had a charming house in the country. Monsieur de Monteveso had established me in a style which he considered worthy of himself, if not of me. He could never forgive me for being what I am. He was tolerated by the returned emigration for my sake, but he grew weary of his own unhappiness, and resolved to live by himself in his own province, where he could be a great personage. Perhaps he is not altogether a bad man. He consented eagerly to my parents, who had obtained permission to return to France, joining me in the country. I tasted again some happiness in the peace of our semi-retired life and in their affection. Our world was that of old society, the world of returned nobles. They hated and despised the imperial power, but most of them were ready to cringe before it. Yes, even the best were overawed by the real might under the tinsel of that greatness. Our circle was very small and composed of convinced royalists, but I could not share their hatreds and their contempts. I felt myself a Frenchwoman. I had liberal ideas. She noticed Cosmo's eyes fixed on her with eager and friendly curiosity, and paused with a faint smile. "You understand me, Cosmo?" she asked. The latter gave a little nod without detaching his eyes from the face which seemed to him to glow with the light of generous feeling. But already Madame de Monteveso was going on. "I did not want to be patronized by all those returned duchesses who wanted to teach me how to feel and how to behave. Their own behavior was a mixture of insolence and self-seeking before that government which they feared and despised. I didn't fear it, but neither could I despise it. My heart was heavy during all those years, but it was not downcast. All Europe was aflame, and the blaze scorched and dazzled and filled one with awe and with forebodings. But then one always heard that fire purifies all which it cannot destroy. The world would perhaps come out better from it. "Well, it's all over," said Cosmo. "And what is it done? The smoke hangs about yet, and I cannot see. But how do you feel?" Madame de Monteveso, leaning on her elbow on the mantelpiece, with one foot on the fender, looked down at the ashes in which a spark gleamed here and there. "I feel a little cold," she said, "and dazed, perhaps. One doesn't know where to look." Cosmo got up and made a step forward. His voice, however, was subdued. "Formerly there was a man." "A man, yes. One couldn't help looking towards him. There was something unnatural in that uniqueness, but do you know, Cosmo, the man was nothing. You smile. You think you hear a royalist speaking, a woman full of silly aristocratic prejudice, a woman who sees only a small Corsican squire, who hadn't even the sense to catch the opportunity by the hair as it flew by, and be the restorer of the Bourbon dynasty. You imagine all that of me. Of me." She kept her pose, desolate, as if looking down at the ashes of a burnt-up world. "I don't think you could be stupid if you tried," he said. "But if the man was nothing, then what has done it?" Madame de Monteveso remained silent for a while, before murmuring the word "destiny," and only then turned her head slightly towards Cosmo. "What are you staring at in that corner?" she asked, after another period of silence. "Was I staring?" he said with a little start. "I didn't know. Your words evoked a draped figure with an averted head." "Then it wasn't that," she said, looking at him with friendly eyes. "Whatever your fancy might have seen, it was not destiny. One must live a very long time to see even the hem of her robe. Live a very, very long time," she repeated, in a tone of such weariness, tinged by fear, that Cosmo felt impelled to step forward, take up the hand that hung by her side, and press it to his lips. When released, it fell slowly to its previous position, but Madame de Monteveso did not move. "That's very nice," she said. "It was a movement of sympathy. I have had very little of that in my life. There is something in me that does not appeal to the people with whom I live. My father, of course, loves me, but that is not quite the same thing. Your father, I believe, sympathized with the child, and I am touched to see that the son seems to understand something of the woman, of an almost old woman." Cosmo would have been amused at the tone of unaffected conviction in which she called herself an old woman, had it not been for the profound trouble on that young face bent downwards, and at the melancholy grace of the whole attitude of that woman who had once been the child Adele, a foreign, homeless child, sheltered for a moment by the old walls of his ancestral home, and the sharer of its life's stately intimacies. "No," he said, marveling that so much bitter experience should have been the lot of such a resplendent figure. "No, destiny works quickly enough. We are both still young, and yet think of what we have already seen." He fancied she had shuddered a little. He felt ashamed at the thought of what she had lived through, how she had been affected in her daily life by what to him had been only a spectacle after all, though his country had played its part. the impressive part of a rock upraising its head above the flood. But he continued, "Why, the man of destiny himself is young yet. You must have seen him many times." "No. Once or twice a year I went to the Tuileries in the company of some reconciled royalist ladies, and very much against my wish. It was expected from Madame de Monteveso, and I always came away thankful to think that it was over for a time. You could hardly imagine how dull that empire time was. All hopes were crushed. It was like a dreadful, overdressed masquerade, with the everlasting sound of the guns in the distance. Every year I spent a month with my husband to save appearances. That was in the bond. He used then to invite all the provincial grandees for a series of dinners. But even in the provinces one felt the sinister moral constraint of that imperial glory. No doubt all my movements were noticed and recorded by the proper people. Naturally, I saw the Emperor several times. I saw him also in theaters, in his carriage, driving about, but he spoke to me only once." "Only once?" exclaimed Cosmo under his breath. "You may imagine I tried to make myself as inconspicuous as possible, and I did not belong to the court. It was on the occasion of a ball given to the Princess of Baden. There was an enormous crowd. Early in the evening I found myself standing in the front row in the Galerie de Diane, between two women who were perfect strangers to me. By and by the court came in, the Empress, the Princess, the Chamberlains in full dress, and took their place on a platform at the end. In the intervals of dancing, the Emperor came down alone, speaking only to the women. He wore his imperial dress of red velvet, laced in all the seams, with white satin breeches, with diamonds on the hilt of his sword and the buckles of his shoes, and on his cap with white plumes. It was a well-designed costume, but with his short, thick figure and the clumsiness of his movements, he looked to me frightful and like a mock king. When he came opposite me, he stopped. I am certain he knew who I was, but he asked me my name. I told him. "Your husband lives in his province?" "Yes, sire." "Your husband employs much labor, I hear. I am grateful to him for giving work to the people. This is the proper use of wealth. Hasn't he served in the English army in India?" His tone was friendly. I said I didn't know that, but I did know that he had fought against them there. He smiled in a fascinating manner and said, "That's very possible. A soldier of fortune. He is a native of Piedmont, is he not?" "Yes, sire." "But you are French, entirely French. We have a claim on you. How old are you?" I told him. He said, "You look younger." Then he came nearer to me and, speaking in a confidential tone, said, "You have no children? I know. It isn't your fault. But you should try to make some other arrangement. Believe me, I am giving you good advice." I was dumb with astonishment. He gave me a very gracious smile and went on. That is the only conversation I ever had with the Emperor. She fell silent with downcast eyes. Then she added, "It was very characteristic of him." Cosmo was mainly struck by the fact that he knew so little of her, that this was the first intimation he had of the Montevesos being childless. He had never asked himself the question before, but this positive, if indirect, statement was agreeable to him. "I did not make any other arrangements," began Madame de Monteveso, with a slightly ironic intonation. I was only too thankful to be left alone. At the time the Russian campaign began, I paid my annual visit to Monsieur de Monteveso. Except for the usual entertainments to local people, I was alone with Count Eleon, and as usual, when we were quite alone, he behaved in a tolerable way. There was nobody and nothing that could arouse his jealousy and the dormant hatred he nurses for me deep down in his heart. We had only the slight discussion, at the end of which he admitted, gnashing his teeth, that he had nothing to reproach me with except that I was what I was. I told him I could not help it, and that as things were, he ought rather to congratulate himself on that fact. He gave me only a black look. He can restrain himself wonderfully when he likes. Upon the whole, I had a quiet time. I played and sang to myself. I read a little. I took long walks. I rode almost every day, attended by Bernard. That wasn't so agreeable. You remember Bernard? Cosmo nodded. For years he had been a very devoted and faithful servant to us. But I suppose he too, like so many of his betters, fell under the spell of Monsieur de Monteveso's wealth. When my parents rejoined me in France, he had his wish at last and married Aglaé, my mulatto maid. He was quite infatuated with her, and now he makes her terribly wretched. She is really devoted to me, and there cannot be any doubt that Bernard has been bribed by my husband to play the part of a spy. It seems incredible, but I have had it from the Count in so many words. Bernard let himself be corrupted years ago, when Monsieur de Monteveso first sent me back to my parents in a rage, and next day was nearly out of his mind with agony at having done so. Yes, it dates as far back as that. That man, so faithful to us in our misfortunes, allowed himself to be bought with the greatest ease. Everybody, from the highest to the lowest, was in a conspiracy against a poor girl whose only sin was her perfect frankness. When Bernard came over to France with my parents, I was already aware of this. But Aglaé wanted to marry him, and so I said nothing. She probably would not have believed me then. "And you could bear that wretch near you all those years?" exclaimed Cosmo, full of indignation. She smiled sadly. She had borne the disclosure, and had kept the secret of greater infamies. She had all her illusions about rectitude destroyed so early that it did not matter to her now what she knew of the people about her. "Oh, Cosmo," she exclaimed suddenly, "I am a hardened woman now, and I assure you that sometimes when I remember the girl of 16 I was, without an evil thought in her head, and in her ignorance surrounded by the basest slanderers and intrigues, tears come into my eyes. And since the baseness of selfish passions I have seen seething round the detestable glory of that man in Elba, it seems to me that there is nowhere any honesty on earth. Nowhere." The energy of that outburst, contrasted with the immobility of the pose, gave to Cosmo the sensation of a chill. "I will not mention us two," said Cosmo, "here in this room, but I know of at least 2 honest men on earth. They are your father and mine. Why didn't you write to father, Adele?" "I tell you I was a child." "What could I write to him? Hasn't he retired out of the world for so many years only not to see and not to hear? That's one of your honest men. And as to my poor father, who is the soul of honor, such is the effect of long misfortune on the best characters. and of temptations associated with his restored rank, that there have been moments when I watched his conduct with dread. Caste prejudices are an awful thing, but thank God he had never a thought of vengeance in his mind. He is not a courtier. I have heard about it, interrupted Cosmo, from the Marquis himself. He is a dear old man. The two by the mantelpiece exchanged dim smiles. I had to come here with him, said Adele. He cannot do without me. I, too, was glad to get away from the evil passions and the hopeless stupidities of all the people that had come back without a single patriotic feeling, without a single new idea in their heads, like merciless spectres out of a grave, hating the world to which they had returned. They had forgotten nothing and learned nothing. I have seen something of that myself, murmured Cosmo. But the world can't be put back where it was before you and I were born. No, but to see them trying to do it was intolerable. Then my husband appeared on the scene, hired this palazzo, and insisted on us all living here. It was impossible to raise a rational objection to that. Father was never aware of half what I went through in my life. I learned early to suppress every expression of feeling. But in the main we understand each other without talking. When we received Count Eleon's letter offering us this house, he just looked at me and said, I suppose we must. For my part, I go through life without raising any objections to anything. One has to preserve one's dignity in some way. And is there another way open to me? Yes, I have made up my mind. But I must tell you, Cosmo, that notwithstanding that amazing tour we made 10 years ago amongst Monsieur de Monteveso's problematic relations, those two sisters and that niece have been a perfect novelty to me. I only hope I never betrayed my surprise, or any feeling at all about it. The Countess raised her eyes to Cosmo's face. I have spoken of it to you, as I have never spoken to anybody in my life, because of old memories which are so much to me, and because I could not mistrust anybody of your name. Have you been wearied by this long tale? No, said Cosmo. But have you thought how it is going to end? To end? She said in a startled tone, which affected Cosmo profoundly. To end? What do you mean? Everything is ended already. I was thinking of your endurance, said Cosmo. Do I look worn out? She asked. Cosmo raised his head and looked at her steadily. The impression of her grace and her strength filled his breast with an admiring and almost oppressive emotion. He could find nothing to say, not knowing what was uppermost in his mind, pity or admiration mingled with a vague anger. Well, what do you see in my face? I have never seen such serenity on any face, said Cosmo. How sure of itself your soul must be. Her color became heightened for a moment. Her eyes darkened as she said in a grateful tone, You are right, Cosmo. My face is not a mask. But he hardly heard her. He was lost in wonder at the sudden disorder of his thoughts. When he regained his mental composure, he noticed that Madame de Monteveso seemed to be listening. I wonder whether the Count is still with my father, she said. Ring that bell on the table at your hand, Cosmo. Cosmo did so, and they waited, looking at each other. Presently the door swung open, and at the same time the cartel above it began to strike the hour. Cosmo counted 11, And then Madame de Monteveso spoke to Bernard, who waited in silence. "Is Monsieur le Comte still with my father?" "I haven't seen him come out yet, Madame la Comtesse." "Tell your wife not to wait for me, Bernard." "Yes, Madame la Comtesse." Bernard backed out respectfully through the door. "How fat he is, and what sleek hair," marveled Cosmo, "and what a solemn manner. No wonder I did not recognize him at once. He showed me into your father's room, you know. He looks a special envoy's confidential man all over. And to think that he is your household spy. I wonder at your patience." "Perhaps if I had anything to conceal, I would have had less patience with the spy," she said equably. "I believe that when we lived in Paris he wrote every week to Monsieur de Monteveso, because you know he can write well. I wonder what he found to write about. Lists of names, I suppose, or perhaps his own views of the people who called with bits of overheard conversations." "It's incredible," murmured Cosmo. "It's fantastic. What contempt he must have for your husband." "The most remarkable thing," said Madame de Monteveso, "is that I am convinced that he doesn't write any lies." "Yes," said Cosmo, "I assume that. And do you mean that the Count is paying him every week for that sort of thing?" "It's an ugly farce." "Don't you think," said the Countess, "that something serious may come of it some day?" Cosmo made a hopeless gesture. "The man you married is mad," he said with intense conviction. "There have been times when I felt as if I were mad myself," murmured Madame de Monteveso. She had heard footsteps outside the door. A moment after, Count Elion came in and fixed his black glance on his wife and Cosmo. He did not open his lips and remained ominously by the door for a time. The strain of the silence was made sinister by the stiff bearing of the man, the immobility of the carven brown face, crossed by the inky black mustache, in harsh contrast with the powdered head. He might have been a sergeant come at the stroke of the hour to tell those two people that the firing squad was waiting for them outside the door. Madame de Monteveso broke the dumb spell. "I did my best to entertain Mr. Latham, but we had given you up. He was just going."